This is actually a two-part presentation. It's an athlete and youth sports safety legislation update and roundtables. And I'd like to introduce our speaker. Judy PULICE is the principal of a consulting firm for small national associations and corporations seeking to influence multiple state legislatures. She has extensive experience in state lobbying, strategy, message development, grassroots training, and organizing. She was formerly the Senior National Manager for State Legislative Affairs of the 40,000-member National Athletic Trainers Association and Director of State Government Affairs for the 150,000-member American Dental Association. In those positions, Judy worked closely with 50 state chapters in their legislative efforts and advised them on governance and administrative matters. A certified association executive, Judy also served as a lobbyist, PAC Director, and Assistant Executive Director of the 22,000-member California Dental Association and was a part of the administration of California Governor Pete Wilson. Please join me in welcoming Judy PULICE.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today among my old friends. So I want to talk to you and tell you the history of this issue. Many of you have heard me give this something like this before. But it's nice to get a reminder, and I also want to hopefully re-energize you if you've lost interest in this issue to get involved again, because I think it's been a great boon to the profession. When we started working on this, our goals were to save some lives, which I'm happy to report we can say we did, to highlight the athletic training profession, which I'm really happy to say we did, create new jobs. I don't know if that's happened or not. I'd love to hear from you anecdotally if you know of high schools that have decided in your area to hire an athletic trainer that hadn't done before. But I hope that that's true. And then I put saving lives on here again because we forget sometimes how many lives are saved literally every week by athletic trainers who get no recognition. Nothing's written up in the newspaper about it. They're just doing their jobs. So our goals, I think we can say, have partially been met. Now, everybody knows that the Zachary-Lystat law passed in Washington State in 2009. Zachary was a young man who was severely injured playing sports. But a lot of people don't know that back in 2006 and 7, and I think again in 2009 or 10, the state of Texas worked on very comprehensive youth safety legislation. And this kind of came about because a mom who had lost her child, who was a tennis player and had a sudden cardiac arrest, and collapsed, and the coach and the other players stood around and watched, thinking she was having some sort of a seizure, and didn't call 911. She happened to be talking to legislators about the needs for AEDs in sporting events. At the same time, a dad from Dallas, she's from Fort Worth, a dad from Dallas was talking to legislators about his son who had committed suicide after using anabolic steroids. And so the legislature took quite an interest in this, and they passed several pieces of legislation, the first one going back to, I think it might have been even 2006. The thing about the Lystat law was it was not only about Zachary, but it also, I think, caught on as it did because the NFL was in the news, there were congressional hearings on concussion, and so at that time, NATA urged its state associations, get out in front of this. Because this is the kind of thing that has a tendency to spread across the nation, and sure enough it did. The focus was specifically on football and on concussion, though. And from the very get-go, that was kind of a sadness that people thought that that was the only thing that could happen to kids on the playing field. The staff at NATA undertook a very scientific study of how many kids had died playing sports, Google. And we found out that in 2000, actually the first one was done by a member in California. He found out that in 2008 and 2009, we'd had 115 deaths reported of student athletes. So we decided that we needed to do something to consolidate this effort and this initiative and capitalize on the public's interest in it. And so we formed something called the Youth Sports Safety Alliance. And our friend organizations joined right away. I think we started out with 25 or 30 organizations pretty early on. Now, what was really eye-opening for me at that time was I was getting to know these parent activists. So what happens is when somebody loses a child at 15 due to dehydration or sudden cardiac arrest or being struck in the chest with a hockey puck, they want to do something. So they often create a foundation, they talk to reporters, they may go to the state capitol, and then this is how they want to assuage their feelings about the death of their child. But for the most part, they weren't working together. They would choose an activity. I want to lobby for AEDs. I want to lobby for steroid testing. I want to lobby for, to wear chest protection for young athletes. And even when I would talk to moms and I'd say, did you know there's another group doing something very similar to what you're doing? I remember this one mother in particular said, I want to work on my foundation because it's named after my son. So we felt like as the athletic trainer is the linchpin in the school for all the health care, the NATA needed to be the linchpin for these organizations. So we formed the alliance and we started reaching out to organizations to join. And we were targeting parent groups, sports organizations, sports medicine related organizations. Now the LISTAT law sort of quickly became the gold standard. It had 4 provisions as I recall. A mandatory removal from play if concussion was suspected, a medical clearance being required for return to play, parent consent to play, which was supposed to be an informed consent, but it was also supposed to be an educational effort so that you would give the parent a sheet of paper about concussion and they would sign that before the child could play, and some coach training. Now, we put together a much longer list of things that we thought could be included in these bills, but that never really got any traction. Those 4 provisions pretty much became the standard. So the next year, in 2010, we issued what we called a call to action, a list of 10 items of things that we thought all schools should be doing to keep their athletes safe. We labeled it a crisis in America. And we had had a summit in January of 2010 in Sacramento, and that was sort of our theme for that summit. We asked our state associations to form coalitions at their level that would mirror what we were doing nationally with the pretty much national organizations. We'd gotten a few more alliance members by the time we had our summit in January, and we saw that 17 states and the District of Columbia had passed concussion laws. Now, a lot of these were passed very quickly. They were passed because there was no cost to the state. It's what we would refer to as a white hat issue. Who's going to be against that? And so it was moving pretty quickly across the country. So much so that we decided to have a second summit in that same year. But rather than picking one state, we moved it to Washington, D.C., hoping that we'd get better media coverage there, and also to engage the interest of Congress. That year, we reported that there had been 48 student deaths. And we also were pleased to enter into a partnership with the National Football League because they were very active already. They had been since the LISTAT law passed, and in sponsoring these bills. And in a few states they hired lobbyists, and others they just made a phone call to the Speaker of the House and a bill got introduced. By 2011, we had 44 student deaths, so it had come down by 4. There were 36 states that had passed the concussion bills, and we had our third summit again in Washington, D.C., and our alliance had grown to 62 members. Now, to show you that I'm not very prescient, I thought by now the issue would be dead. No pun intended. That people would have lost interest in it, that reporters would have stopped writing about it, but instead it was growing. There was more written about this issue than I could even believe. In 2012, we had only 34 deaths reported in the news about students. 44 states had passed concussion laws, and states were starting to have these other issues, bills introduced about sudden cardiac arrest or steroids or dehydration or heat illness and that kind of stuff. We had 83 members join. These are organizational members, and that's an amazing thing to get 83 organizations to sign on to your call to action and say, yes, this list of things that you want done is something that we can buy into. And we started messaging a little bit differently. We said, you know what, this is not just about football. It's not just about concussion, and it's not just about high school. There are a lot of kids playing these contact sports at earlier ages, not to mention in community leagues and so forth. In 2013, there were 32 deaths reported. And I think clearly, I don't think anyone would take issue with the understanding that this was and had to be in part due to awareness, and certainly in the heat area. States had started to adopt, their state high school activities associations had started to adopt guidelines, and even some ones that were very similar to the NATA's guideline on dehydration. So the awareness has to be of coaches for sure, as well as parents who were keeping a closer eye maybe on their kids. So by 2013, we also had all but Mississippi had passed a concussion bill. We had our 4th summit, and at that we added a new thing, which was to ask the Alliance members to go up to Capitol Hill and talk about a student-athlete Bill of Rights. We released something called the National Action Plan for Sports Safety. And by then we had 120 member organizations. We also did something I'm particularly proud of. We started something called the Safe Sports School Award, and Jeff mentioned that when he talked yesterday. If you haven't ever looked at this, it's a list of about 40-something different requirements for a school to undertake in order to be eligible for the award. It's not an award that only one group can get or one school. It's open to any school that meets the requirements. Its purpose was to obviously recognize these schools, but also to increase public awareness. I think Jeff also said this, which is that we wanted a principal to say, wait, I see your banner, how did you get that? I want one of those. Well, how you get that is you get an athletic trainer. We also felt that for those schools that had athletic trainers, the award and that list of these recommendations on things that they had to do would give the athletic trainers some backup or support to go to their administration and say, look, if we only had this one thing, we could get this award. And that's exactly what happened. I got a call from a member one day, and she said, I want you to know that you saved a life. She said, we meet all the requirements for the Safe Sports School Award, except our coaches had not taken the CPR training. My principal would not require it of them, and they didn't want it. So I went to him and I said, look, we can get this award with a banner to hang in our gym if we only do this one thing. So he said, okay, do it. So she did the CPR training for her coaching staff, And 2 days later, one of the coaches saved somebody's life. And so that was all that I needed to hear to know that we were on the right path. By 2014, we had 28 student deaths. All 50 states then had concussion laws, and in fact, many of them had started to go back and look at the bills that they had enacted because things needed to be tweaked or clarified or whatever. There were at least, last year, there were at least 60 bills in 25 states on some type of youth safety issue, whether it was AEDs or whatever. We held our 5th summit, and then we also did a Capitol Hill that day in Washington in 2014. And the Alliance had grown to 151 members. So we continued to get new organizations joining. There was also a benchmark study released, which was very important to really quantify for the first time in many years how many high schools in the country actually had full-time or part-time athletic trainers working there. There was a wide variance, and it was pretty low if you looked at full-time, but pretty good when you looked at least schools who had part-time access to an athletic trainer. Now, it's not clear exactly what access meant, but the map is interesting because if you're in the Northeast, it's very high, and then it gets less and less as you go west, with wider geographic areas between schools and so forth. By this year, we held our 6th summit in March in Dallas to see how that would go. The Youth Sports Safety Alliance has, I understand it's more like 230 members now. And public interest was still high against my everything I believed. At that first summit in January of 2010, our media impressions were measured at 15 million. And I'll tell you a little anecdote about that too. We invited one of California Athletic Training Association's sponsors for their licensure legislation to speak at that summit. And she came and she did such a typical political thing. She talked for 15 minutes, said nothing, and nothing on point to why we were there. And she left, and I was disappointed, and that was that. But the next day, when we were at the airport going back to Dallas, in the Sacramento paper, I'm reading an account of our summit. I got so excited. Look, it's on the Metro page, above the fold. I'm excited to read this. And she was not mentioned. And while I was sitting there in the waiting room, somebody from the CATA called me and said, "We just had a call from Assembly Member so-and-so. She wants to get more involved in this area." Apparently she read the Sacramento Bee too. By March, this last March, when we had our 6th summit, the impressions were 132 million and climbing. We went from 15, almost 10 times greater interest in it. That's not a testimony to what we did, really. That's about the level of public interest in this issue. So the concussion laws we're going back, they're being revised. There's other issues that bills are being passed on some of these other issues. But my concern is that there are gaps in these bills. As I said, they were passed pretty quickly and pretty easily because they basically did those 4 things I described. They may or may not have indicated who was responsible to take the child out of play. They mostly indicated who could clear a child to go back to play, even though that was a little bit soft in some cases. They may have said the coaches needed to be trained, but they didn't specify how or when or how often. Left that up to the state activities associations. And they didn't push any particular guidelines. And in fact, there was at least one state and maybe 2 where it was up to the individual school principal to develop guidelines on how they were going to handle a concussion at their school. I can't imagine what that felt like to the principal that got that information. So, but mostly my concern is that there is no enforcement. Most of the bills are written so that it's the Department of Education who may be responsible to put out public information, or it may be the Federation chapter in that state. But what happens if a coach doesn't allow a child to be taken out of the game or doesn't require medical clearance to go back? Not much of anything. So enforcement is definitely something that I think should be looked at. And you know, when Mark mentioned yesterday level 2 providers, what occurred to me was, wow, this is what can make the athletic trainer known as a level 2 provider. And I want to take issue maybe with some of you who answered to Carol earlier that you didn't think you had very high visibility among people. Now, admittedly, my focus, my prism is focused on legislators. But I can tell you that the first National Conference of State Legislatures that I attended 10 years ago on behalf of NATA, I had people, and probably the second and third year, I had people coming up to the booth looking at our sign going, athletic trainers, what's that? Or sometimes they would come up and say, oh, I was an athletic trainer in high school. And so we were working on this, education of these people. By the time I went to my last one last year, that was a thing of the past. No one said that anymore. Now it was more likely they would approach our booth and say, can you help me with my shoulder? Or tell me about this concussion legislation, or tell me, what are your members doing? Now, as I was saying to Dana a few minutes ago, unfortunately, one of the follow-up things I would always say to people is, do you know any athletic trainers in your state? And almost always the answer was no. So they knew of you. They knew of the profession. They knew that you were involved in this concussion debate. They knew that your organization had been in the Capitol lobbying on behalf of the bill, but they don't know you, and that's something we need to work on. The concern I have, despite this fabulous increase in media impressions and reporters, we're getting, NATA gets a lot of good feedback from reporters, sports writers in particular, about coverage for athletic training. The danger in this kind of thing, having 50 state concussion bills enacted, is for politicians to say, well, we took care of that problem. And so this messaging of it's not just football and it's not just concussion and it's not just high school is very, very important, because we need to still continue to keep the pressure on while there's still interest in the issue. To say, look, there are 40 things that your school can do to keep kids safe, or there's one thing you can do, which is hire an athletic trainer. And I really think that that would be a tragedy if they thought the problem was solved. So where do we go now? Well, I think that this expansion that I have seen of other related bills, other parent activists who've seen what, well, my kid didn't die of concussion, so maybe I can get the same thing done for what did kill him. I think we'll continue to see that for a little while. I think what we need to have is a more defined public policy role for safety in schools, for health care in public schools. That seems to be the way we're going. And we need to expand these protections to the league sports. I would hear from members who would say, when we started practice on Tuesday, the kid didn't tell me he'd gotten a concussion on Saturday playing soccer. So, maybe there's somewhere in there for some more coordination of that sort of stuff, or if those leagues were hiring athletic trainers, maybe that would make a difference. And I would like to posit to you that there may be a role for the regulatory agencies, and that's what our breakout's going to be about today. Certainly, I believe athletic trainers need to be in the lead on these discussions. I described you as the linchpin, and that's what you really are. at least in those settings. But I do think that your regulatory agency, if it's allowed under the law, may have a role as well. So that's my challenge to you today, and I think that Tom's going to explain that in a little bit more. And with that, I will thank you very much for letting me come and talk.